Good morning. Today's lecture we're going to be discussing emergency incident rehabilitation. And we're going to cover a couple of things. One of the things we're going to be discussing is how we define rehabilitation for emergency workers, discuss the importance of a rehab for fire and emergency services, and understand situations warranting and the criteria for initiating the rehabilitation. Throughout this lecture, we're going to learn different objectives. Some additional objectives we're going to learn are the impacts of heat stress on emergency workers, and then the opposite, what's the wind chill impact on emergency workers. And we're going to learn appropriate placement for a rehab area. Where are we going to put these rehabs so we can have a safe operation? We're going to learn reasons to send emergency workers for medical evaluation. We're also going to learn the criteria that should be met before emergency workers are able to return back to duty. And also we're going to discuss reasons for not allowing injured personnel to return to work for active duty, and also we're going to learn reasons to transport emergency workers to appropriate hospitals for further evaluations. Other objectives we're going to be discussing will be the physiological consequences of fluid loss for the fire service, and we're going to define osmolarity and discuss the importance of osmolarity in the rehydration of the fire and rescue personnel. What is rehab and why do we need it? Well, the background of rehab is, for many years, the fire service has treated the elements of job-related danger as a badge of courage, worn with pride. Now, firefighters would boast on the elements of danger when discussing the merits of various occupations. In the last 20 years or so, the attitude of the fire service towards safety has changed dramatically. Firefighter department officials began to realize that needless deaths and injuries of firefighters are not the badge of courage, but indicators of problems. Firefighters extended beyond their safe operation periods. That results may be stress, fatigue, related illnesses and injuries. Firefighters, although uninjured, will be fatigued to a point where which they are unable to continue in the operation. And the mental and the physiological fatigue firefighter may make poor decisions at that scene and can get hurt and cause injuries. Also, what is rehab? When we say you gotta go to rehab, what is rehab? And in emergency services, rehab describes the process of providing rest, rehydration, nutrition, and medical evaluation to responders who are involved in the extent to extreme incident scene operations. Rehab operations are not only responsible at a fire or an emergency scene. Other activities are involved that might necessitate rehab situations. Training exercises. Fire departments are out there and EMS personnel out there doing training exercises in the heat and the cold. Well, you have to have a rehab area for them so they can put nutrition back in their system. Also, athletic events. A lot of communities are running marathons throughout the towns. The fire service and EMS are standing out there for hours and hours and hours in the heat. They got to rehydrate their bodies properly. And parades and events. A lot of communities have events in the town, parades. Dignitaries respond to the town, so you're going to have a rehab area so these firefighters and EMS personnel can get rehab and get nutrition back in their system. Other activities that the fire service are getting involved with is assisting our fellow police officers in their training activities. There are days where they're out doing SWAT activities or live ammo shooting. They're going to be out in the sun also. We'll be out there supporting them. So there are a lot of support activities that we'll be involved with that rehab's part of the situation. We're supplying water to the PD. We'll be supplying water to our firefighters. These statistics were supplied to me by the National Fire Protection Association. Over 50% of all firefighters' deaths are due to some extent are directly attributed to stress or overexertion. We're going to discuss a little while what are the functions of a rehab operation. There are physical assessments. You get sent to a rehab center, you're going to be doing physical assessment of the firefighter. Revitalization, rest, rehydration, and nutritional support. Medical evaluation and treatment, conditional monitoring of physical condition. You'll be getting your blood pressure taken. You'll be getting your heart monitored. And if you need to, you'll be transported for those requiring treatment at a hospital. At the rehab operations, you'll be getting done initial critical incident stress assessment. Hopefully you'll be able to watch that person to see if they're having any difficulties during that incident. And last but not least, if during a rehab operation, you get your reassignment. If they figure you're going to have to go back to doing your duty, you get reassigned to your next task for the next period of time. As you'll see in this slide, it shows you from the beginning to the end of what happens when your physical assessment of that person, going through the medical evaluation, the revitalization, if he has to be transported, the continual monitoring of physical conditions, and you start the initial conditional stress management on the individual, and then the reassignment. So you'll see on this slide that whole picture on how the rehab operation works. What is physical assessment of a firefighter or emergency service personnel? Basically what happens is you get to that rehab center, they'll be doing basic vital signs. They'll be taking a medical evaluation of you. They'll be revitalizing and you do your reassignment. What is revitalization? That's where you get a rest. You're taking a 5-10 minute rest, so an adequate amount of time for core temperature and your vital signs to return to normal. Fluid replenishment provides with appropriate fluid to replace those lost. We're all sweating a lot at the fire scene or the training activity. You got to put that fluid back into your system. And nutrition. Should receive some nutritionally sound food, granola bars, peanuts, things like that. We're not chomping down hot dogs and foods that won't digest properly during that heat. We want to eat solid foods that you can nutritionally intake into your system. Medical evaluation and treatment. Firefighters who appear ill or injured should be assigned to personnel in the medical evaluation treatment area of rehab. And these should not be delayed by providing with drinks and food unless the medical evaluation shows this to be a priority. Monitoring of physical conditions. Firefighters in the rehab area should have their conditions continually monitored. Firefighters who meet the criteria for release from rehab should be reassigned or for release for care. And firefighters who do not respond to rest or medical attention may require more intensive interventions. No one should be released from rehab until he or she is medically sound and medically cleared and is transported to a medical facility for further treatment if needed. Now, you as a firefighter, you must be honest with those taking your blood vitals and statistics that if you're on certain medications, so we have accurate readings so we know if there is a situation going on. Knowing when to establish rehab. As I've been saying through this whole lecture, the goal of emergency incident rehab is to lessen the risk of injuries that may result from extended operations, which are carried out in adverse weather conditions, other factors, the heat and things like that. So when do we set this rehab center up? Ideally, rehab operations should be commenced whenever emergency operations pose a risk of pushing personnel beyond the safety level of physical and mental endurance. Extended fire incidents, hazmat incidents, prolonged rescue, adverse weather conditions, I was saying before, we have to deal with crimes and working with the police department and standoffs and other crime scenes, and search activities. We're going to be out there searching for people lost in the woods, people falling in the rivers and lakes. We're doing search operations. You're going to have a rehab area set up. Extended fire incidents. What are we facing out there? With structure fires, high-rise structural fires, and wildland fires. Weather conditions, hot weather, ambient temperature, relative humidity, direct sunlight. Cold weather is the ambient temperature, and the big thing is the wind chill factors. Hot weather. Under the ideal climate conditions, fire hazmat incidents and rescue operations place a variety of thermal stress on the responders operating at the scene. Let's face the fact, we emergency workers, we must frequently perform heavy physical labor in heated atmospheres while wearing bulky, heavy equipment. In these ideal conditions, when the responders have completed their assignment, they go to a safe area such as rehab, we remove the equipment, and we're able to cool our systems down. You'll see on this next slide a picture of a firefighter wearing the equipment in that heat. Ambient air temperatures are related to humidity, can be factored together to create what is often called as a heat index. Working in direct sunlight can add 10 degrees Fahrenheit to that heat index. And working in full turnout equipment can add an additional 10 degrees of Fahrenheit on that heat index. And you'll see it on the next chart, the complete hot temperature with the heat index and how hot it can really get while you're doing these physical activities. On this slide, you'll see the injuries associated with heat stress, at what temperature, what happens to your system, and the injury threat that you can get. It goes from 60 degrees all the way to above 130 degrees, and what extreme danger or potentially heat stroke that you as a firefighter can be facing. And heat stress index, the United States Fire Administration, the USFA, they recommend that rehab operations be initiated whenever the heat stress index exceeds 90 degrees Fahrenheit. That 90 degrees that I mentioned is the heat index. So let's be realistic. If it's a 70-degree day outside with the 10 degrees in the sunlight and another 10 degrees Fahrenheit, we're in turnout equipment, we're hitting that 90-degree mark. So that 90 degree is the heat index that we have to worry about. I just talked about heat index and the hot weather. Let's reverse that to the other side. Cold weather conditions. Often overlooked when determining the need for rehab operations are the effects of cold weather on responders who must operate in low temperatures and low temperature conditions for a long period of time. Cold weather possesses different rehab challenges to the emergency responders than the warm weather scenarios do. As I talked about earlier, the potential threat to the well-being of the emergency workers from them, however, is just as great in cold weather. An emergency worker insufficiently protected against the cold may have their body core temperature lowered to a dangerous level under extreme circumstances, and this condition is called hypothermia. The most common cold weather-related injuries among emergency responders are localized cold injuries, commonly called frostbite and frost nip. These injuries occur when particular parts of the body are exposed to the extreme cold for extremely long periods of time. Just as heat and humidity combine to increase the impact of heat, cold and wind combine to impact the effects of cold upon human bodies. The combination effects of cold and wind is referred to the wind chill factor. This chart will show you the temperature and with the wind what the actual temperature is, and that's called the wind chill factor. The USFA, the United States Fire Administration, recommends initiating rehab operations whenever the wind chill factor drops to 10 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. And you'll see by that chart, it's really not that hard to accomplish with the wind and the temperature. We can hit that 10-degree mark very fast and rapidly. As I mentioned before, there are other situations that rehab may be necessary. Crime scenes and standoffs. We're working with the police departments on their activities. Search activities. We're looking for lost hikers or people who are lost in lakes. Public events, parades, dignitaries who are coming into the communities. And the big one is training events. Crime scenes and standoffs. What happens is bomb squad members have been operating for a long period of time and they're wearing heavy protective equipment. We're out there working with them on that. And police tactical units may have been operating in positions for a long period of time as well. They're going to be needing rehab, so we're going to have to be assisting them both out in the field and during rehab. Search activities. In large areas, searching for people who have been wandered away from their homes. We had it in this community where we had a person who had Alzheimer's actually left their house, and it was 12 degrees out. So we had personnel out in the woods, out on the streets looking for this woman. We had to set up rehab so they could get some warmth into their system. Urban search and rescue incidents following natural and man-made disasters, and they're going out there for hours at a time. They're going to need rehab. And searching for climbers and hikers and others involving sporting or recreational activities, swimmers who get lost, they're going to have rehab set up for the emergency services personnel who are out looking for these people. Public events. Communities have fairs, carnivals, and other festivals. A lot of fire departments run them. So while you're doing these, most of the time they're at night or during the hot and humid weather during the summer, you're going to have a rehab set up for the people walking around doing EMS work or doing fire watch. Auto races. A lot of communities have auto races. Parades, concerts, major sporting events, political rallies. You have now all these big political rallies going on. If you're EMS and fire service out there protecting the public, they're going to have rehab areas set up. And large-scale religious ceremonies. These are done in communities where the fire and EMS personnel are out there assisting those who might need it during these rallies. You're going to have a rehab area set up. In regard to dealing with the law enforcement, They're not used to us setting up rehab or dealing with rehab situations. So you as an incident commander might want to talk to that local sergeant or police sergeant who's in charge of the operation and tell them this is how we work and we have to set up a rehab so their members are safe as well and join us during getting our bodies replenished. Establishing and managing a rehab area. The first 5 minutes of an incident can dictate the outcome of the next 5 hours. Once the need for rehab has been established, the most important decision, and one that must be made almost immediately, is to where to locate that rehab center. Make a good initial choice for the location. Rehab is vital. Trying to relocate rehab later in the incident can be very difficult to nearly impossible. So once you get that location set up, you don't want to be taking it down and putting it over to another location. Once you have a designated spot, maintain that area for the rehab. Locating the rehab. Close to the incident command. More easily kept track of who's in rehab. And it's easy to anticipate when people will be ready to go back to doing their jobs and assignments. A more efficient use of the equipment. Away from the incident commander, it's easier for the personnel to relax and there are fewer distractions. And you'll see in the next slide a whole setup of a house fire where the apparatus is set up and where the rehab area is set up. As you'll see in the slide, the rehab set up in areas in a really good location, close to the command, so command can see who's going in and out, who's available, but yet it's far enough away from everybody. It's easy access for the squads, ambulances to leave in and out of the areas without being blocked by the fire apparatus, and the fire apparatus aren't tripping over the EMS people. What could be wrong setting up the rehab? It could be too close to the operation where we're interfering with the incident commander. Or sometimes I've seen it where they put the rehab upwind, so when all the smoke's blowing from the fire into the rehab tent. So you got to make sure you pick a location where it's not going to be interfering nor being affected by the fire. Once command decides to have a rehab section, the person in charge will be the rehab officer. He has to make the decision of where this tent or where the rehab area is going to be, and we're just discussing that. The second issue is, more importantly, that all firefighters must attend. They cannot bypass going to rehab. Policies will be created, and policy will be enforced, and once you get done at that operation, you must go through rehab and be evaluated. A lot of departments, a lot of members have that macho image that we don't need to go through rehab, but you have to go through it. Site characteristics of the rehab center. The site should be large enough to accommodate all those that need rehab. The site should be freely of vehicle exhaust. We don't need exhaust from the trucks and all apparatus blowing onto us while we're trying to get rehab. And the site should be as quiet as possible so we can relax while we're getting our blood pressures taken. Access to the site by the media should be restricted. The last thing we need is the media taking pictures of us while we're getting our vitals being done. And the site should provide SCBA replenishment and refill. You should be able to change your bottle for your SCBA at the rehab center. Also, the site should have easy access and exit routes for the ambulance. We don't want to block them. They have to take us to the medical hospitals or other facilities. The site should have a supply of running and drinking water, preferably a lot of drinking water. And it's helpful if the restroom facilities are part of the rehab. If the incident involves recovery of fatalities, the rehab area should be out of the view of the work area. We don't want to have the people being rehabbed near the people who are being brought out for fatalities. We don't want to mix them. We want to keep them separate from each other. This chart is a schematic of a floor plan of a rehab center. You'll see where an easy single entrance that comes in, place to hang the gear, SCBA support there, a medical treatment area, and an ambulance staging area. This is a perfect one to be set up for a rehab area. Staffing in a rehab area. The most highly trained and qualified EMS personnel on the scene should provide medical evaluation and treatment in the rehab area. EMTs must ensure that the sector provides a safe area in which fire and rescue personnel can rest and receive rehydration. EMTs must identify fire and rescue personnel entering the rehab area who are at risk for heat and stress-related injuries or illnesses. The role of the rehab staff is EMTs should have an AED readily available if an unlikely but statistically important event that a fire rescue personnel experiences cardiac arrest during a rehab. And EMTs must ensure accountability for the fire and rescue personnel who enter and exit rehab. EMTs must medically monitor crews to determine whether they are fit to return to activity for the fire and rescue operation, require additional hydration and rest, and require transportation to emergency department for further evaluation. One of the most important roles that the EMT does during the rehab operation is they give reports and updates to the incident commander and the safety officer on the progress and the health of each firefighter who has been through the rehab section. The amount of time that a responder will require in a rehab will vary depending on varies of conditionings. Number one is the respondent's level of physical conditioning. Is that firefighter in good shape? Number two, the atmospheric conditions, the heat, the cold. The nature of the activities the respondent was performing prior to entering rehab. Was in a very stressful situation, confined space, was he climbing high-rise steps? And the time needed for the adequate rehydration. Rest during rehab. It is recommended that departments establish a minimum amount of time that a fire rescue personnel spend in rehab. This will vary with the atmospheric conditions and the number of personnel available during the operation, but a good rule of thumb is for each personnel to spend at least 20 minutes in rehab. The hydration that occurs in a rehab is very important to the responder's recovery. Personnel perform heavy work under stressful conditions. We're wearing heavy coats, heavy equipment. We're subject to extensive fluid loss. While fluid loss is obvious in hot weather conditions, do not overlook the fact that dehydration can occur in the cold climates. Maintaining sufficient levels of water and electrolytes in our body can greatly aid in the prevention of heat or stress-related illnesses and injuries. As you'll see in this chart, how easy it is for us to go from losing 2% body weight to up to 6%, and the severity and how dangerous that is, and the different types of injuries that could occur. In this part of the lecture, we're going to be talking about osmolarity, and that can be defined as the thickness of a fluid is determined by the electrolytes and carbohydrates contained in that beverage. The higher the osmolarity, the longer the time it will take to absorb that fluid in your system. So in general, it's recommended that the rehydration solutions do not exceed the osmolarity of 350 milligrams per liter. And you'll see on this following chart that they have the whole listing of from all different types of liquids that were out there and the osmolarity of each one. As you'll see in that chart, the last column has the osmolarity of all different drinks, from our sports drinks down to water. And you see the importance how great water is, only 10 to 20%, where some of these sports drinks and sodas are very high in numbers. And unfortunately, when we go to rehabs, that's what we're usually getting, is the sodas and the sport drinks. That's why it's important to have the rehab centers set up where there's water is available most times. Medical evaluation. On entry into the rehab, each fire rescue personnel should be triaged to determine if the medical treatment or transport is necessary. On entry, any fire rescue personnel with the following should be sent immediately to the treatment area of a rehab. A blood pressure greater than 200/110 or a top number below 90. No fire rescue personnel should return to active duty after 20 minutes of rest if he or she presents with a blood pressure greater than 160/90 or a top number falls below 100. No fire rescue personnel should return to active duty if they are presented with an injury that may be worsened by return to duty, or if an injury that might be in any way impair the performance of the injury. We don't want to send you back out there, back on the job, if your injury is going to interfere with your performance and make things worse, not only for yourself or for someone else. Any fire rescue personnel should be considered for transportation to a hospital if they have come down with chest pains, shortness of breath, alerted mental status. If you're not being yourself, if you're acting a little weird, or things are not going perfect for you, you should be sent to the hospital. Skin that is hot or either moist or dry, and the most important, irregular pulse. Any fire rescue personnel should be considered for transportation to the hospital if she or they have an oral temperature of greater than 101, or a pulse of more than 150 beats per minute, or a pulse more than 140 beats per minute after a cool down. So if you're resting after 20 minutes and your blood pressure, your beats per minute are still at 140, you should be taken to the hospital. Any fire rescue personnel should be considered for transport to the hospital if he or she presents with a blood pressure of 200/130, or any emergency workers should be considered if they are unable to orally rehydrate due to nausea and vomiting. If you can't put fluids in your system and you're throwing it back up, you should be taken to the hospital right away. And you'll see the next few slides covers what we just talked about in length. Bring back to your firehouse, go back in the back room, discuss this with your officers, and answer these questions. This will make it easier for you to understand the rehab policy, to understand what rehab's all about, and how to perform rehab. In this program on rehab, we discussed a lot of things and discussed a whole different way a rehab area should work. So in summary, I would like to just capitalize a few of the issues. We decided when and where to initiate rehab, and decide where to set it up, and decisions that must be made easy, early and easy on in the beginning of the incident. Rehydration and constant monitoring of the fire rescue personnel is the most important thing that rehab people do for us. And following accepted guidelines for returning emergency workers back to their duties. While we'll aid both returning fit workers to duty while at the same time keeping stressed and injured workers from risking causing further harm to themselves and to other firefighters. And that's what basically we all want. We want everybody to be safe at the operation and when we're done operation.